When I first heard that Will was writing a book, I thought there could be a possibility that he was going to be writing a book about all the wit and wisdom that he had heard me saying for the last few years. But no, he had to write about himself. All joking aside, to read an autobiography through the eyes of the autobiographer about the people who helped him become a person he is most intriguing. He kept my interest throughout the book. To those of us who live in the area, he talks about places we know. And of course, he talks about Nigeria, a place that I have not been to. And though I had read about it, I learned so much more through his words and experiences. This is a very personal book, but it certainly keeps the readers absorbed throughout. When I asked Will to sign my book, he wrote, and I quote, "Sidney, thank you for being a great colleague and crying buddy." For that, I must explain. Will and I were at an event together, I think it was a few years back already, Will. We were at an event together a few years back, and I believe the question was asked about what we wanted our legacies to be. Thought about it for a moment and really got a little emotional in discussing the topic, and started to tear up a little bit. And of course, Will started out his answer with that little bit of teasing that he and I enjoyed doing to each other, pointing out that I was near tears. Not 2 minutes later, during his discussion, he became very emotional as well. Thus, our crying buddy friendship began. Will Jawando is a proud husband, father, and council member. His book gives us an insight on how he became who he is. Please join me in giving a warm, and today it's a hot, please give me a warm Gaithersburg Book Festival welcome for my crying buddy, Will Jawando.
Thank you, Sidney. Let's give Sidney Katz, the forever mayor of Gaithersburg, a round of applause. No offense to Judd Ashman, who's doing a great job.
Thank you.
So, Sean, do you want to, I don't know who's introducing you, but we have a great moderator, so I'm going to let you maybe introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, so hello, everyone. My name is Sean Felix. I am a local author, primarily of poetry and artist. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and currently live in Hyattsville, Maryland. It's really a pleasure. There we go, yeah. It's truly a pleasure to be here with all of you, and an honor to actually interview Mr. Jawando here on stage. It is an incredible day, and this book is an incredible book. There's so many points at which your experience resonated with my own experience as a black man in the United States, and in an effort to get to know you a little bit better, I have a couple of sort of author questions to ask you first, and then sort of get in depth into the book as well. So my very first question is, so since this thing came out, you've been on a bit of a whirlwind. So I've been sort of following you. You're here, you're there. I saw you with Michael Dyson, saw you with Ibram Kendi. I was like, oh man, I want to be with Ibram Kendi and like up in Boston. Like, that's cool. But in terms of an author question that I had, memoir is very difficult for me. For you, what was the process of writing this book? Like, were those memories readily accessible for you, or was there a process that you went through to get to where you were to write this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sean, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this today. And a big shout out to my wife, Michelle Jawando, who's in the back there, and my children, Aaliyah, Addison, Ava, and William Isaiah, who are there too. This is their first event that they've all been at. And my mom, Kathleen Jawando Jacob, in the back. And my mother-in-love, Denise Parker Lawrence, Michelle's mom. All right, I got that out of the way. I had to do that. So the process was, as you said, it's a personal book, and I know we'll talk about that. the way it's organized, for whoever hasn't read it yet, I know after this you're going to run over there and buy it, and I'm going to sign it. It's an introduction in 7 chapters, and each one of my black fathers is a chapter. Starts with my stepfather, Joseph Jacob, who I meet when I'm 6 years old after my parents' divorce, and ends with my biological father being chapter 7, from whom I'm estranged and we don't have a relationship early on, which creates the vacuum and void for these other men. There's a lot of we'll talk about the other men, I'm sure here. But the process was very, there's a combination of memory, and interview. So of the 7, 5 are alive. So I was able to interview 4 of them. My biological father passed in 2017, about 5 years ago from cancer. I detail that process. Mr. Williams, who was my 4th grade math teacher at Oakview Elementary in Silver Spring, he passed in 2019, but I didn't know that until researching the book. And so I learned about him. His interview is really interesting. So I didn't know, your 4th grade math teacher, you know them as Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, right? I didn't know his first name. And through the process of researching the book, I found through MCPS and through his daughter and grandchildren, about him, that his name was Charles Chuck Williams. And he was actually a teacher in his 2nd career. His first career is he was a captain in the U.S. Army, and he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. And he retired and then became an elementary math teacher at MCPS, right? Think about that. And so I meet him in 1992 at Oakview Elementary, a chubby kid being bullied. His parents had just divorced, trying to really find my mooring. And he's the first black man I've ever seen wear a jacket and tie every day. He comes in, looks like Morgan Freeman, that kind of similar face, the small bush, brown skin. He looked majestic to me. And he taught me math. He taught me about myself. He helped me deal with bullying. And so I know I'm going a lot further than your question, but it's interesting. But I only knew him 9 months, right? Your teacher's about 9 months. And I never see him again. But he's chapter 2 in the book. And I wish I would have caught him before he passed in 2019. But it's just an example of the diversity of these men and how they all gave me something that they needed. So I wasn't able to interview him, but I was able to research him. So it was a combination of research, getting back to your question, interviews with those who are alive, and then my memory, and then just putting the context around that of what was going on in the world in some cases at that time.
Fantastic. Thank you. So in terms of memory, I started to think about growing up myself. When people ask me my story, I always dig back into, I grew up in Northeast Washington, D.C., right at the intersection of North Capitol Street and Rhode Island Avenue.
Very close to Catholic University?
Yes, indeed. And I actually have a connection to Catholic University again, but we'll get to that later. But when people ask me about my childhood, those memories are they're right there. Like, I know that neighborhood. I grew up in an all-black neighborhood. The only white people I knew were the sisters that lived in the convent up the street and my teachers at school. So my neighborhood was very distinct in my mind. I was wondering if you could sort of detail, over the course of the book, you talk about your Silver Spring. I was wondering if you could detail sort of your Silver Spring in your growing up.
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are seats in here if you guys want to get out of the sun, my family. Okay, all right. So Silver Spring is this place, and it's so interesting in so many ways. You all are from here, many of you are from here. Silver Spring is not an incorporated city, right? It is an amalgamation of, post office, 12 zip codes, and very diverse in who's there. And I actually start the book framing it in this context of this study on race and economic opportunity, right? Which is really what helped me frame the book. About 3.5 years ago, the New York Times reported on this Raj Shetty study out of Harvard and Stanford, which showed it took the 20 million children born in the United States between 1978 and 1983. There were 20 million children. I'm in that number. And it looked at where they lived based on census information. What were the demographics of those households? One parent, two parent, level of education. And it looked at their IRS data. How much are those households making? So it put all that together. And it was a very landmark study. They're still looking at the data and using it to inform policy. But one of the things it showed was that for black boys and white boys from the same neighborhood in the same background, so two parent, one parent, level of education, grew up in the same census tract, that they had wide earnings gaps 40 years later, right? And no matter, all the things you hear about, well, they didn't try hard enough or didn't have a parent at home. No, the only thing different from these kids was that they were black and one was white. And they had wide earnings gaps 40 years later. And that was true in 99% of census tracts across the country. So devastating. Doesn't matter, that was the case. There were these 1% census tracts where that was less so true, not as much true. And Silver Spring has a couple of those zip codes. And where my mom worked and where Steve Lash, who's here, who worked with my mother for 30 years, and I don't think I've seen her in 30 years, they worked in downtown Silver Spring on Pershing Drive, 20910, which is that zip code. Now, I didn't live there, but that was one of the 1% zip codes where white boys and black boys from the same neighborhoods are doing similarly well. So I got interviewed by the New York Times, and they asked me, well, what's special in Silver Spring? And to your point, I had grown up seeing really the dichotomy of my community. So I grew up in Long Branch in Quebec Terrace, which was less than two miles from this zip code. But it was a very different situation. Gunshots, poverty. I used to, especially when my mom and dad divorced, we lived in a one-room apartment where there were so many roaches and mice and bugs at night on the floor that I didn't get out and go to the bathroom and I wet my bed often because I didn't want to touch the floor. And that was 2 miles from this black boy safe zone zip code in downtown Silver Spring where my mother worked, which ended up being my after-school community, where I went every day. I talk about in the book decision kids versus destination kids. And I was a destination kid. When I got out of school, when I got out of Oakview, for example, I would go to my mom's job, and I would encounter all these great people. Steve was one. Jay Fletcher, who's in the book, was another. He's one of my black fathers. And one of the distinguishing characteristics in this study about the 1% zip codes is that they had a larger proportion of working class black fathers in them. So not necessarily the fathers of the children themselves, but these men were present in the community at a higher rate. That was statistically significant. And when I thought about my life in this book, I realized that I met 4 of my 7 black fathers in this zip code. You think about that. So I wasn't exceptional or anything. I would benefited from these men being close to me. And indeed, I met 3 of them at my mom's job, 20910. Jay Fletcher, the first openly gay black man I ever meet, who's a reporter there at the job. Joseph Jacob, who's my stepfather for more than 30 years, who's the printer at Business Publishers. Mr. Williams, who I meet at Oakview Elementary. Dean Sanwuya, who is the IT guy at the Business Publishers, who takes me to my first trip to Nigeria. So I meet 4 of my 7 fathers because I had a place to go after school. And I talk about my friend Kalfani in the introduction, who unfortunately lost his life to gun violence when we were teenagers, and he was a decision kid. The bell rang, and I meet him in 5th grade, and he's like the coolest, best basketball player. I looked up to him. He took me under his wing, and I think about him every day. At the end of school, he had to decide where he was going to go. There was no after-school program. His mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses in Bethesda as a night nurse. His dad wasn't in the picture. And he got involved with things he shouldn't get involved in. And that was something that stuck with me, that I benefited from this side of Silver Spring that had more opportunity in it. And that's still the case, I think, in a lot of our county, where there's places where you have abundant opportunity, and there's some where it's more scarce. And that was certainly my upbringing in Silver Spring, seeing the dichotomy of those 2 things, and it really formed who I am.
That's fine. Yeah, it's really clear. as you read and sort of unpack that throughout your book, the things that sort of become clear to you as you get older and you start to see your community and as an adult and see how those things play out for the people that you interact with. I was thinking of, speaking to that point, you mentioned the twice as good paradigm that many black parents talk to their black children about. It almost feels like black males especially have to become superhuman in order so that, because our mistakes have dire consequences. Can you tell us a little bit more about battling that pathology and giving, so that black boys can just have that opportunity to just be?
I was getting emotional as you asked the question, because you said superhuman, right? Which is true. That's the twice as good or three times as good you have to do. And the study bears that out in a devastating way. That if you do everything, one of the things the study shows too is if you're born a millionaire as a black boy in the United States of America, you have a 50% chance to drop to the bottom quartile of earnings as a millionaire. Flip of a coin. If you're born as a millionaire as a white child, 90+% that you're going to stay a millionaire in this study. So you talk about superhuman. But I just think my experience, and I think we're still just struggling to be seen as human, much less superhuman. And that was my experience. And the data shows that. You know that there's studies that show that black boys in particular are at a very young age, in single digits, stop being seen as children and start being seen as older than they are. You know, I always think about Tamir Rice, who was shot and killed in Ohio. This 12-year-old boy who had a toy gun at a park. He was killed in less than 10 seconds when the officer arrived. And the officer said on his cam, I have a 18-year-old kid with a gun, or 18-year-old man. You know, he was 12 years old. And much of my experience in school, a lot of my schools, I go to 5 schools before I'm in 8th grade. Because several of the teachers, thank God for my mom, who fought for me and didn't let them put me on Ritalin or refer me to special education, which is another story that we see all too often. One of the things I really hope with this book is to show the humanity of black boys and black children. And not only show it, but show that in spite of the system that we're in, right, in spite of the twice as hard, that there is an antidote, there is a cure to the stereotypes and the tropes that plague black men and boys and other marginalized communities. It is the presence of diverse, committed, intentional black men in the lives of these young men. And now that doesn't mean we shouldn't address the systemic issues. We absolutely should, and I talk about that in the book too. But it shows that there is and it certainly was my experience, that there were these life rafts that helped me, course correct and keep me on the right path and give me the love and affection I needed. So I really hope that this is as a love letter to black men and boys, but I think it's applicable to everyone. We all have people in our lives for whom steered us in the right direction. And if you think about the intentionality behind, it's the last thing I'll say on this point, because we could talk the whole time about this. The intentionality behind those stereotypes and tropes that hold black men and boys back, they're very intentional. If going back 500 years, you had to create that our skin was bad because we were lazy or aggressive or not smart. You had to do that to justify the system of chattel slavery, which is our economic system. And you had to attack the men in particular to dehumanize them in such a way so that they devalue themselves in order for the system to perpetuate. And nothing makes me sadder than when I see a young person, particularly a young black man or young black boy, who doesn't understand the value that they have within them. All children should understand their value, and So I hope that this will show in a very personal way that value, but also the superhuman power of engagement of other concerned black men that can literally save the lives and alter the trajectory of black men and boys and of all children. And that's something that is an ongoing work, but I hope that this adds to that conversation.
Thank you for that. So speaking about one of those men, so Mr. Williams, your chapter about Mr. Williams deeply resonated with me. So I'm a school teacher.
Give him a round of applause for that.
And for many of us, so I teach 6th grade, and our school.
That's a tough grade.
So, and our school starts at 6th grade. We're 6 through 12. I teach at the Edmund Burke School. And I'm usually, for many of my students that come into my room, the first black male teacher that they encounter in their school career. And your story about Mr. Williams, it resonated me in that way, but it also reminded me of when I was in 7th grade. So when I was in 7th grade at St. Gabriel School in Petworth, we were bad. We were bad kids. I think we ran through 7 teachers, including the principal. And it was all bad until a man named Mr. Buddy showed up. And Mr. Buddy was, he was from Africa. He was a reporter who became a 7th grade teacher. He primarily taught geography. And he came into the room, and I remember him coming into the room, and we were still doing our thing, cutting up, trying to, see where his weak spots were and get him. And he stood up, and he was the first person that stood up, and he said, "No." And we all sat down. And it was incredible. And I texted my mom earlier. I was like, "What country was Mr. Buddy from?" And she's like, I can't remember, but I'll get back to you. And so I'm not going to check my phone now. We're just going to go with it. But you talk about the power and impact of Mr. Williams' presence. Can you expand on that in our present day situation in our schools? You have a statistic at the end. 7 to 8% of teachers in the United States are African American, but only 2% are actually African American men. Like, can you speak to that point a little bit, like sort of expand on your experience?
Yes. I'm glad you came back to Mr. Williams, because Mr. Williams is like, it's funny, I hope you read the book and tell me, and then write me a message about who your favorite father is. Barack Obama's chapter 6, he's pretty cool, but people have asked me who's my favorite. Mr. Williams is in the top 2 for sure. And that's including my biological father, my stepfather. Obviously they're all very important, and they all gave me important things. But Mr. Williams resonates because I think he just so perfectly epitomizes the point, what I think is the thesis of the book, that you can have a dramatic impact on somebody in a short period of time, particularly as a black young man or boy, by seeing someone who looks like you, by seeing them demonstrate excellence. Mr. Williams, as I mentioned, was the first black and only black male teacher I would ever have. Wore a suit and tie every day. He actually gave me my first tie and taught me how to tie it. Right? I stand in the mirror today, 40 years old, I tie my tie, and I think about Mr. Williams. He's the first person that told me it was okay to fail and then learn to do better, right? Much of my elementary age, I'm shunted around from school to school, and I'm raising my hand to answer a question, and I'm told to be quiet, and I'm told that I'm acting out. Mr. Williams is the first one to embrace my inquisitive nature. And he's also the first person I see code switch. If you don't know what that means, it means talk, speak very correct English in the classroom, but I saw him talking to a janitor, and I talk about this in the book one day, and he's talking about the game last night or something. They're like, man, I went down there, they're just talking. And I was shocked. I didn't know. I was like, Mr. Williams? And it was, but it was, even at that age, I didn't understand it, but it was letting me know that it's okay to be more than one thing. It's okay to be who you are, to be a full person, to be whole, right? The subtitle of my book is The Men Who Made Me Whole. And I only know him 9 months. I don't know his name. One of the call to actions is the book is that we have to enable more of these relationships, right? Either have them ourselves, if we're a black man or boy, with other black men and boys. But again, I think this is a universal story. Everyone needs engagement. If I asked everyone in this room, who are their 7? Who are the people that had an impact on them and made them who they are? Everyone would have an answer. A teacher, a parent, a colleague, an aunt, an uncle. But this engagement, and it also shows if you have a teacher that looks like you, particularly for black children, in the elementary years, statistically, you will have higher grades in middle school and high school. That's how powerful it is, just on one measure. But I was a chubby kid. I wore rec specs to school at this time. Thanks, Mom. No, it's because I kept breaking my glasses. So at some point, they just wear the rec specs. And I was getting bullied. And Mr. Williams just came to me at a time where I needed to see something that I could aspire to, and he was that. And as I mentioned, the impact that he had was just transformative. I wish I would have been able to tell him, but I've told his children, his grandchildren. And 2% of the teaching profession, if you're a superintendent, if you're a teacher, I just spoke to the Bond Educators group in Montgomery County, which is a group that was formed to help recruit, support, train black male teachers, who are only 2% of the teaching profession. We need to have programs and policies and individual relationships that improve those outcomes and make sure that there's more of us in the classroom like you. So I'm just really happy to hear you're there. We got to pay you more. We got to value you. Yeah. I was just with my good friend Aruna Miller, who's running for Lieutenant Governor of the state of Maryland. And I know this isn't a political event, but just a fact. And we were with the county educators, talking about how hard the last 2 years have been for them. And I don't have to tell you that we make it very hard to be a black male educator, a black teacher in this system, and we have to support better. So Mr. Williams is amazing, and I hope that every child, my daughter Ava, wave to everybody. Stand up, Ava. Okay, she's shy. All right, that's Addison. Addison's standing up for Ava. Ava's in the 2nd grade, and she goes to school here in Gaithersburg at MCPS, and she has, this year, the first black teacher that she's ever had. And she came home from school the first day, and she said, Mommy, Daddy, I have a black woman teacher. And she was like, just like her eyes were just expanded, and it just shows the power, of these relationships. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm gonna get sort of deeper into some of these fathers that you mentioned. One part about, and this sort of speaks to your childhood and growing up, and as you move forward in your life, you talk in your chapter about Wayne Holmes, about being saved from emptiness and loneliness, and about how you felt in the world. I feel like we all hit those crossroads. Why do you think we hit these points? And how do we build up our children to stave that off? You spoke to, teachers, but then Wayne Holmes has a special moment for you. Like, how can we speak to that overall? Like, how can we actually build our children up so that they don't confront it when you confronted it?
Well, Wayne is all of these characters are awesome. And they're not characters, they're people. They exist. But Wayne Holmes is 6'6", probably about 400 pounds now, but he'll get mad at me. But he was a offensive lineman for Penn State. He was an All-American at St. John's College High School, where I got a scholarship to. And he is a teacher there when I'm in high school. And he's also the football coach, and he also starts a choir, a gospel choir, unsanctioned, by the way, at St. John's, that I peer in the window. I'm the proverbial onlooker. I peer in and I see them practicing after school, and I have a deep affection for gospel music. I actually tell my faith journey in this book as well as a Christian, and I joined this choir, and it's the first. I talk about it as the first inclusive, truly inclusive group that I've ever been a part of. There's all sorts of kids in it. There's all sorts of nationalities, races, genders, sexuality in this group, and we're all accepted. And, I'm a basketball player. I'm like the jock, and all these kids in the choir are not that. And so he really helps me do a couple things, and I'll answer your question. Realize that I can be more than one thing, right? That I don't have to be typecast into one category. I can sing and play basketball. I can be vulnerable and work hard as an athlete, because he did it. Here's this guy, this huge guy, who would have gone to the NFL. He got a devastating back injury while he was at Penn State, and came back and became a teacher. One of the 2%, right? One of the black male teachers. And when I have a devastating kind of a set of events in my athletic career, I get recruited down to college to play basketball. The coach leaves, and I'm kind of pushed to the side. And this is after beating DeMatha by 2, and I'm the captain of the team. And you guys know from here know what that means. That's a big deal. Played in the city title game at the then MCI Center. I didn't know what I was going to do. And Wayne takes me to school, and then when I come back, my parents had moved. I lived with him for a year while I go into the AmeriCorps program and save money to go to school the following year at Catholic University. And Wayne really helps me through that period of depression, really, and loss, and helps guide me to the next phase of my life. And I think one of the things that I love about the way this book is, and it's mostly chronological, is that each of these men, to your question, helps me at a point where I need them to step in and love and guide me. And it's not a one-time thing. And it's not all on one person, right? Mr. Williams, 9 months in 4th grade. Joseph Jacob, my stepfather, my entire life. But he comes at a point where I'm desperate for attention. My dad, I describe him in the book, my biological father, as an absent presence. He's in the house until I'm 6, but doesn't talk to me. And I'm desperate for someone who looks like me to engage, and Joseph is that engagement. Barack Obama, I meet when I'm 25. When I'm working on Capitol Hill, and I work for him as in the Senate and the White House, while I get married to Michelle and we have 2 of our 4 children, he helps me in my development as a husband and a father. So they all help at critical points where I could definitely have zagged, and I did, and they bring me back. And I think that's what Wayne did for me at a very critical point, coming out of high school where you don't know what you're going to do. You thought you were going to do something, and then it's snatched from you, and who are you? And he said, you're a lot of things, and you can be a lot of things, and just helped me navigate through a very lonely and physically, I come back, I go to North Carolina Central. My parents have moved to Manchester, Maryland. Anyone knows where that is? It's near Westminster. It's like almost in Pennsylvania. I have no home. I have no room. The room I lived in is gone. And I have no scholarship. I have no school. I don't know what I'm going to do. And Wayne steps in and gives me a place to live. He helps guide me. And it was a critical, I often think about what I could have done or not done if I didn't have him at that moment.
Thank you. All right, so I want to leave us time getting the signal. We got 10 minutes, and I want to give us time for Q&A for folks. So if you would, we'll have a microphone for you, and you can just rise up and ask a question.
Just remember to speak with your mouth close to the
And we can always keep talking if no one has questions. But
Yes.
I'm sure he has questions.
If he- Yeah.
Hi. So I would like to know, from a policy perspective, what else you think needs to be done in Montgomery County specifically to remedy the continuing racial disparity in the school systems. And as mostly white people that you're speaking to here today, aside from voting for great candidates like yourself, and by the way, if you wanted to make a governor endorsement or tell us about it, that would be helpful. You know, what else can people do who care?
Thank you for that question. And Sydney, I was looking for you when I first started crying, so thanks for setting me up. You know.
I was looking for you, too.
Well, Sydney and I often talk about we are in so many ways we're bookends, and I'm going to answer your question of the council in that he went to segregated schools in Montgomery County years ago, and I think about my experience in Montgomery County in the school system, and we still have these disparities, which aren't unique to us, right? But they're persistent, and we have 211 schools, so policy. You know, I get very frustrated, and sometimes my colleagues get frustrated with me because I'm frustrated about the pace of change, right? I cannot abide that there are still decision kids out here, that we have 211 schools and we don't have an after-school program when research shows us from 3 to 6 are the critical hours where you have to have kids on track and having them engaged. That's a policy and budget decision. If I'll come to you as the voters and say, we need to make sure that we have enough tax revenue to provide an after-school program for every child who needs it. That should not be in question because we're going to pay for it on the back end. Now, we've made progress. I'm proud to work with my colleagues on how many we've expanded over time. And we made a significant investment in wellness centers this year in this year's budget. But we have to move faster because the schools I went to, Oakview and others, there are still schools on that list, when I look at the list, that I knew needed this 30 years ago. And so there's some really basic things that we have to have a conversation about our social contract. Who are we going to be? Are we okay with allowing teachers to be underpaid and schools to be under-resourced and programs not to exist? Because there's a cost to that. And we need to talk with ourselves about society. So I think that's one thing, like enable. Then support nonprofits that are enabling these relationships. You know, I talked to our superintendent, and I mentioned the Bond Group, which exists to create a more welcoming environment for black male educators and recruit them. We need to create pipelines into education for more teachers that look like our diverse student body. Our student body is majority black and Latino and Asian, 75%. That's our student body now. It's not the student body from 30, 40 years ago. So we have to meet the needs of our students today. We also need to make sure, here's the other thing that doesn't always come up. I think about Kalfani's mom, who worked 2 low-wage paying jobs. And she had to work 2 because she couldn't afford housing and couldn't afford to live here if she didn't. What if we paid people enough to work 1 living wage job, right? And that meant she could be home more and be more engaged, right? How do we relieve the pressure? What if we provided childcare for young people, you know, for families that need it, right? So all those things factor into these relationships. And then you didn't ask this, but on an individual level, we need to enable these relationships to happen more often. We all have a role. Like if you know a child that needs these relationships, that's a black man or boy, introduce them to someone, get them in a program. But have them yourselves too. This is not just about us. I just think they're super powerful in our context, but everyone needs these relationships. And so I would say, that's what I would say. I could go on forever, but that's what I would say. I think those are some of the things we do. And I think I gave you my endorsement when I introduced Aruna Miller, who's running with Wes Moore. So.
To your point, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in an area that was very homogeneous, and our teachers lived in our neighborhood. They were friends of our parents. To add to your list, we need affordable housing so people like teachers and firemen and policemen can live in our communities.
Absolutely. You took the words right out of my mouth. And actually, we worked on a bill to create a tax credit for public safety workers, but we need to add it to teachers We need state authority to do that. That's something we want to do. I agree with you 100%. Being in the community, there's no replacement. The affordable housing issue is such a connector. If you're a wealthy person, you're worried about will your kids be able to afford to live here. If you're low income, you're worried about making it right today. We have to build more housing, make it more affordable, build different types of housing. That's something that I'm proud to work with my colleagues on as well. Can we do one or two more? Okay. Anyone else? One more? Una más? 5 minutes. We got 5 minutes. Okay, come on up. There you go. One or two. We'll squeeze it in. I'll answer shortly.
Well, it's not a question, it's a comment, and I'm so proud of you doing this book, being from Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm a proud resident of Silver Spring, Maryland. Michelle, where are you? Hey. And a very proud member of our church, Kingdom Fellowship, which you belong to, and I'm so happy that you're here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Besides your responsibilities in the council, what is your other life? I mean, how do you?
Yeah. That's a great question. You know, and I meant to say this when you asked me about the book process. This has been a whole nother avenue to have impact. My whole life, I just want to help improve the lives of others. And my opening passage to my book is to my children, Aaliyah, Addison, Ava, and William Isaiah. I pray I learned these lessons of fatherhood well. That's my dedication page, because my number one job is to be a good husband and father to them and to give them opportunities. But then how do we expand? How do I make Kalfani's situation less likely? My friend who died of gun violence. And I see this book as another avenue to that. There's only so much you can do, and I've worked in policy for a long time at the local, state, and federal level. That is important, and I do that as my day job with my colleagues. But this is about having people understand the power of these relationships and having them themselves, enabling them. So I guess I have to add, I spend my time as a writer now. You know, I wrote this during the pandemic, which I needed to do. You know, I talk about the pandemic. We had 3 pandemics, particularly if you're a person of color. You had the health pandemic, which disproportionately impacted communities, but impacted everybody. You had the economic fallout, and then you had the racial justice moment. We watched George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery be murdered. It all happened at the same time. And I wanted to write something that said, here's something we can do about that as we work to fix the system. But I really like movies. I like playing basketball. I'm really looking forward to Top Gun, Maverick. Those are some of the things I do. Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. I think we're done, right? Are we done? Or can we do one more? We can keep going. Okay, we can do one more. Anyone have a burning question?
Before anyone stands up, I just wanted to give a shout out to my wife Janine,
Yay.
Abigail, and Nathaniel up here up front.
Good job. Good job.
Thank you.
Am I planning to write another book is the question. You know, it's a lot to write a book. But I was on with Tavis Smiley the other day. I was part of the book tour. And he said, you did a really smart thing. You wrote a book about the first part of your life. And he compared me, which was a scary comparison, to Maya Angelou in the sense that when she wrote I Know Why Caged Birds Sing, which was a part of her, she wrote a young memoir about her early part of her life. So I don't really touch on in this book anything I've done in office or professionally. This is just really about, you know, my growth and development, and it's more of a personal book about my relationships. So I hope I'll do some things that require me to write another book, but yeah. I agree with that. I agree. Well, I just want to say thank you to all of you. I will be signing book. Thank you. Yes.